Hi there. Today from Joan's Kitchen we're going to be making refried beans, or in Spanish, frijoles refritos. This is a traditional dish in Mexico. It's a staple in Mexican homes, and it's also found in a lot of Mexican dishes that we have here in the US. It's a really easy dish to make. It's not expensive, and I'm going to tell you about making it from dried beans as well as from canned beans. As always, if you have any questions, please go ahead and pop them into the comments, and I will do my best to answer you, either on the live or when this is replayed later. I do monitor the comments. So, to make refried beans, you need to start out with beans. The traditional refried beans are made with pinto beans or pinto beans, and in Mexico, or in Spanish, pinto means spotted. So these are the beans that look kind of just like plain pink beans, but they have little brownish spots on them. So I don't know how well you can see what's in my hand, but each of the bean, there's like a pinkish background and then little brown spots all over them. And what I'm doing with my beans is I'm going to take a small handful of beans at a time and just kind of run them through my hands and look at them, because when you're doing the dried beans like this, it's not unusual to have little bits of dirt or even little rocks inside of the beans. And if you don't do it when they're dry like this, really look them over, when you're cooking them, you might not see them anymore, and it's a nasty surprise for somebody to bite into a little rock that was packaged along with the beans. This particular bean, I'm sure you probably can't see it, but there's like a clod of dirt on it. So after I go through kind of looking at and sorting my beans by hand, I am going to be rinsing them off under running water. And I'm going to be adding a couple of things into the pot of beans to flavor them. And then I'm going to be cooking these. You've probably heard that when you're cooking dried beans, it's best to soak them at least overnight. And that's just to get them ready to cook, because they're dried and they need to rehydrate to become the cooked beans that we're used to. It's always a good practice to do that if you're in a hurry and don't have 8 hours or overnight to soak the beans. One of the things that you can do is bring the beans, cover them with water and bring it to a boil, turn the water off and let the beans sit in the hot water for about an hour, and that is called a quick soak method. The other thing now, with the technology that we have with Instant Pots, you can cook beans without having to pre-soak them. And something that I learned actually in a cooking class in Italy, where beans are also very popular, is if your dried beans have been purchased relatively freshly from the store, relatively recently, so they're fresh, you really don't need to pre-soak them. Honestly, I've never tried this with pinto beans, but the Italian kind of beans, like the cannellini beans, I have made those without pre-soaking when I've just bought them that same week, because I know I'm going to use them, and they have cooked up just perfectly well without being pre-soaked. So I'm almost done here with my pound of beans, kind of looking at this in my hand while we are going through here. I'm putting them into a strainer, a colander in the pot, because I am going to be rinsing these with water before I start cooking them. And there's the last of my pot. This was a nice bag of beans. There didn't happen to be any rocks in there, but it is something that you want to look for, because it's not uncommon to find rocks in there. So when I'm cooking the beans, I'm going to be putting them in a pot of water with several inches of water to cover, but I'm going to be adding a few other things to kind of flavor the water and ultimately flavor the beans. And this is how my mother and my grandmother both made it. And as I was making my test batch yesterday, it was so nice to walk into the house and have the aroma that smelled like my grandmother's kitchen. My grandmother and my mother were both from the state of Jalisco in central Mexico. And it was always good to go to my grandmother's house because it always smelled good. She always had a pot of beans or something on the back of the stove. So one of the things that we use to flavor the beans is chicken bouillon. You could also cook them in chicken stock, but chicken bouillon is just fine. I have actually a big jar of chicken bouillon, and this is the Nor brand that I got probably in a Mexican market because the label is in Spanish. And these actually, even in the regular grocery store, it's going to be a lot less expensive if you pick them up in the Hispanic aisle rather than getting the bouillon cubes in the soup aisle. You can use bouillon cubes. This is just powdered bouillon. I will show you what that looks like. It's just loose powdered bouillon, so for this I probably would use about a tablespoon. It's quite salty, so you don't need to add any additional salt. If you're a vegetarian and you don't want to use chicken stock or chicken bouillon, it's not a problem. You can just put salt into the water. I wouldn't over salt it. I would say for a pound of beans, start out with a teaspoon of salt because the salt will get absorbed into them and you really don't want to start over salting something in the beginning to ruin it. I also use cumin in the beans. In Spanish this is called comino, and again this is an industrial size jar. Cumin, the powdered cumin is ground cumin seeds. So cumin seeds look a little bit like rye seeds, and they grind them up, and it's a very fine powder, and it has a very distinctive smell. It's something I think it's used quite a bit in Indian cooking as well, but when you smell it, you'll know it. My mother did not used to use cumin in her beans, and there was one time when our family was visiting another family in Mexico, and the dad, Jorge, was a great cook, and he came over her shoulder and said, oh, you have to add cumin to that. So I actually add cumin both in my bean water when I'm cooking the beans initially, and then I also add more of it when I'm frying up the beans. And since I'm going to be frying these, I'm going to leave this out. You also want to have a little bit of garlic go into the water with your beans, and you also want to have some onion, and the onion is going to actually be chopped up and cooked in there, and it's going to be mixed into the beans when they're fried. So I've got a half of an onion going here, and I'm just going to chop this really roughly because the pieces are going to kind of fall apart when they're cooking, and ultimately they are going to get mashed up into the beans when we're doing the refrying, so that you don't have to chop it up real fine because they're going to break down when they're cooking. So basically I've taken each half of the onion and cut it to 6. The other ingredient that I really like to add to flavor my beans is a poblano pepper, and I'm going to hold this up for you. It looks kind of like our green peppers or our green bell peppers that we're used to having here, but it's a variation. Peppers are indigenous to Mexico, so when the Spaniards came here, that was where they, discovered peppers. Peppers were something that the native people here in Americas had been harvesting for years. In Mexico, there are over 150 different varieties of peppers. In Mexico, pepper is called chile, C-H-I-L-E. And the ones that we're probably most familiar with here in the U.S. are jalapeno peppers, which are also the most popular peppers in Mexico. Jalapenos are small. They're probably about this big, maybe 1.5 inches long and 1/2 inch to 1 inch wide. They're fairly spicy. I think some people might call them mild, and they're used all kinds of ways. They're chopped up and put raw in salsas. They can also be pickled. They can be stuffed. They can be deep fried. So think about like the jalapeno poppers that you get here. And Chipotle peppers are also very popular. Chipotle peppers are actually smoked jalapenos, and then typically when we buy them here, they're in adobo, and basically they have the dried peppers that are then smoked, and then they marinate them in some kind of like a vinaigrette sauce, and that's what makes the adobo that is also used as an ingredient here. The poblano pepper, the word poblano refers to the state of Puebla, which is one of the states in Mexico, and that's where this is from. Poblano peppers are most commonly used to make chiles rellenos. Chile relleno is simply a poblano pepper that's actually been kind of heated up over an open flame or on a really hot pan to get the skin off. And you cut a slit in it, you take the seeds out, and you stuff it with cheese. Then you dip it in like an egg and flour batter, and you deep fry it, and they're delicious. Poblano peppers are one of these peppers that you never know how spicy it's going to be. It can be very, very mild, or it can be really spicy. And it starts out at the tip being pretty mild, and the closer that you get up to the top, the spicier it gets. The seeds can also be spicy. One of my favorite restaurants in Chicago used to have a little disclaimer on the menu saying, don't blame us for the heat of the peppers, it's Mother Nature. And it's really true. You could buy a handful of them at the store, and some of them can be really spicy and others can be totally mild. But for this recipe, I'm going to use the pepper to actually flavor the beans. So I've washed this off. I'm just going to cut off the top. I'm going to cut off the bottom too, and kind of peel open the pepper to get out the seed area. I don't want to use the seeds because the seeds have kind of like extra heat. So here's my pepper with the top and the bottom cut off and just kind of pulled apart. And I'm just going to slice that into some really thick strips and add that into the pot along with my onions and my garlic, my chicken bouillon, and my beans. The other thing I wanted to show you is that the poblano pepper, like we just were using, are also dried, and when they're dried, they're called a chile ancho, and this is what the bag looks like. You'll see these again, even in conventional supermarkets. If there's a Mexican section, they'll have bags of dried peppers. And so the ancho chile is a dried poblano pepper. And these have a beautiful flavor. When you get them, they're like really, really dark brownish red. It has kind of like a soft and pliable consistency. And so typically to use these, you would soak them in water to soften them up. You can also open them up, either cut them open or just tear them open, and they still have the seeds inside. The seeds in here are dried, so it's very easy to shake the seeds out. And these dried ancho peppers are the basis for the famous Mexican sauce, mole poblano, which is the sauce that has a lot of ingredients, including the peppers, nuts, chocolate, maybe some chicken stock to thin it out, that's typically served over some kind of poultry and also with rice. And this is also the basis for enchilada sauce. So in future episodes, I'll probably be making some enchiladas because those are actually very easy and very quick to prepare. And once you've made your own enchilada sauce, you probably will not go back to using bottled sauce. But I just wanted to share that with you about how the poblano pepper, when it's dried, becomes an ancho pepper. I have taken the liberty of pre-cooking a pot of beans and pepper. And I have that right here. And the other thing is, when you're frying your beans, you want to cook them in some kind of fat. And I actually have a jar in my refrigerator that's labeled with bacon grease. When we cook bacon, we save the grease. It's a really good ingredient to have on hand for cooking things. In Mexico, they may just use plain lard. You can buy lard in the store. It comes in a block. It looks like a box of butter, but it says lard on it, and it's typically not refrigerated. It might be with your shortening section. And the Spanish word for it is manteca. So if you see a box that says lard or manteca, that's the right thing. Lard is basically rendered pork fat, and it's similar to bacon, except bacon you have the bacon flavor because it's rendered from the pork that's been smoked and flavored for your bacon. If you don't want to have animal products in your beans, it's not a problem. You could definitely substitute olive oil. You could also use Crisco. If you're not vegan, butter is an acceptable substitute. If you're using lard or bacon fat, in my opinion, that adds a lot of flavor. The olive oil or the butter or other oils like that, in my opinion, don't add as much flavor, but you're also still going to be getting a lot of flavor from the cumin and from the peppers and the onions and the garlic. So I have my bacon fat already melted here in the pan, and I'm going to start just spooning in the cooked beans. And I cooked the beans and I kept them in the water that I cooked them in. And the reason is, as these are starting to cook, they'll be drying out a little bit. And I don't want to keep on adding more bacon fat into the pan. I'm going to be adding actually some of the cooking liquid from this to kind of keep it thin and stirring. And I'm going to mash this with a potato masher, just a regular old potato masher. So the beans, when you cook them on top of the stove, they need to be cooked enough so that they're soft enough that you can mash them with a potato masher. One of the things I want to mention, the most economical way, and I think the tastiest way to make these, is to start with using dried beans. But if you don't have time for that, you can also start with a can of beans. And basically, you start at the point that I'm at right now. Now, the can of beans is probably only going to have beans and liquid and maybe a little bit of salt for a preservative. If I was doing refried beans from a can, I would actually open the can, drain the beans and rinse them off, and then put them right into the pot with a little bit of oil, either the bacon fat or olive oil or whatever your preference is. Chop up some onion and pepper if you have it. If you don't, that's no problem. But also then add some cumin in there. And then if you need to thin it out, just use water or a little chicken stock, which again you can make by reconstituting chicken bouillon. So I'm starting to mash this up here. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that beans were also indigenous to the Americas, as was corn. And beans and corn together have amino acids that are the building blocks for a complete protein. So this, having beans and corn together, was a protein source for the indigenous people who were here. And the tortilla is the, we would call it bread that was made from corns. And that goes back to the times that the Aztec and the Maya were here. They had figured out how to grind the corn and make tortillas out of them, and they would make a bean paste and spread it on the tortillas, which, if you think about it now, it's kind of like what we do. Among the more common dishes that you may be familiar with that use refried beans would be things like tostadas, which are actually deep fried or baked tortillas that usually have a layer of refried beans on the bottom, and that's kind of like something to hold the other things that you put on top of them, which is typically meat, maybe shredded lettuce, tomatoes, maybe sour cream, and some kind of protein, you know, shredded chicken or beef, you know, goat, whatever it might be, avocados, and you have them flat, you just take bites out of them. Beans are also an essential ingredient in burritos, of course, and tacos. And beans are also just a good thing to have on the side. Probably you've been to a lot of Mexican restaurants where your entree comes with a side of beans and a side of rice on the side. One of the things I wanted to mention also, if you're not making refried beans, if you just make a pot of beans with the peppers and the onions in it, that's actually just ranchero style beans. So the idea of calling beans refried when we're really only frying them once is a little bit misleading. But my understanding is that the translation of the word refried in Spanish doesn't really mean refried like fried again. It's really just meaning fried, and it could be something that even means like hearty. I'm going to give a little shake of the cumin in here. The beans, when I'm doing them this way with the potato masher, they're going to have kind of a chunky consistency. Most of the beans will be mashed up. As the bean flesh gets mashed, it kind of turns into like a paste, and there's starch in there which is going to be serving to thicken this. And so as it starts to bubble and pop and thicken, that's when I'm going to be adding some more of the bean liquid in there to keep it the consistency that I want. If you want beans that are smoother consistency, you can always take a hand blender like this right in the pot and get them the consistency that you want. Another alternative, if you don't have a hand blender, would be to put them in a conventional blender, but you just want to make sure that you have enough liquid in there to whirl them around. So I just added a little bit of the cooking liquid from my pot into my beans. And these are going to keep on cooking until they have the consistency and the flavor that I want, which can be a very personal thing. I tend to like mine a little bit more on the dry side, to the point that when they're cooking, there's going to be like a little crust that's going to be forming on the bottom of the pan that I'm going to keep folding back into it. But that's really it. That's the extent of the recipe. What I like to use these for is for tacos, for burritos. When my family makes tamales, usually at Christmas time, I think the favorite variety of tamales that we make are bean tamales. We take the masa, which we buy prepared, put it on the corn husk, put a spoonful of beans on there, a little slice of cheese, and wrap it up, and you steam them, and you have these delicious little packets with beans and melted cheese inside of the tamale dough. One of the things that I like to do with homemade refried beans too is make my version of nachos, which is a little bit different than the nachos that you would get at a baseball stadium. At a stadium, you're going to get tortilla chips that are kind of almost like Doritos, those like perfectly round ones that probably have a lot of seasoning on them, and they're going to pour spicy cheese over it with has like, you know, jalapeno flavoring or something in it, and then they're going to have sliced jalapenos on top. When I make nachos, I do the traditional tortilla chips, which are made from real tortillas. They're probably triangular, like the restaurant style chips. Put little beans on them, put a little chorizo on them, which is the Mexican style sausage, and maybe some guacamole and some onions and tomatoes and sour cream, and also just regular cheese. Actually, what I would do would be to put the beans on the tortilla chips with the cheese, run it under the broiler, and then put the other toppings on top. And they're delicious. It's a little bit different than what you get. I mean, back in the day when you ordered nachos in a restaurant, that was kind of what you got. It's changed a little bit, but that's how I like to make them, and people do seem to enjoy having them. So as I mentioned, that is pretty much it. I'm going to keep on stirring here, but I'm going to let you go. So from today in Joan's kitchen, frijoles refritos, refried beans. Does anybody have any questions before I sign off here for today? If not, I'm going to go ahead and say adios for now, and I will see you back here next week. Thank you so much for watching.